A wealthy mogul disowned his son, casting him out of their mansion for impregnating a waitress. But months later, when he finally visited him, what he saw left him utterly paralyzed. Julian Morgan stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his opulent Los Angeles estate, gazing out at the sprawling city skyline. The golden hues of the setting sun gleamed against the glass facades of towering skyscrapers, casting elongated shadows over the empire he had painstakingly built from nothing. Morgan. The name itself was more than just an identity. It was a brand, a legacy, a symbol of power, wealth, and absolute control. And Julian had spent a lifetime ensuring that nothing and no one would ever tarnish it. With a slow inhale, he turned away from the breathtaking view, clasping his hands behind his back. His study, an expansive chamber lined with mahogany bookshelves and adorned with priceless artifacts, exuded nothing but authority. Every inch of this house, of this carefully curated life, had been meticulously designed to project strength. Julian Morgan had no tolerance for weakness. The door creaked open. "Sir, your son is here," the butler announced, standing stiffly at the threshold. Julian exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. Theodore Morgan, his only son, his greatest disappointment. The boy had been given everything. Elite boarding schools, Ivy League universities, private mentors handpicked to mold him into a worthy successor. He was supposed to be the heir, the future of the Morgan dynasty. Yet, no matter how much Julian pushed, Theodore had never quite measured up. Too soft, too emotional, too unwilling to embrace the ruthlessness necessary to survive in their world. And now he had made the gravest mistake of all. Theodore stepped into the study, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw set with quiet determination. Julian studied him carefully. He bore the signature Morgan features, chiseled cheekbones, piercing blue eyes, an innate air of confidence. But there was something different in his gaze tonight, something Julian wasn't accustomed to seeing in his son. Defiance. "You wanted to see me?" Theodore asked, his voice level, controlled. Julian let the silence stretch. An unspoken power play. He moved toward his massive oak desk, letting his fingers trail over the polished wood before finally speaking. "I assume you know why you're here." Theodore let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. "Dad, listen." Julian cut him off. "You got a waitress pregnant." Theodore flinched at the venom in his father's voice. "Her name is Amelie," he stated firmly. "And yes, she's pregnant. We're having a baby." Julian's grip tightened on the edge of his desk. "A child. A Morgan." His voice was dangerously low. "Do you even comprehend what you've done? Do you realize what this means for the family, for the business, for everything I have built?" Theodore's gaze remained steady. "It means I'm going to be a father," he said, conviction threading his voice. "It means I'm going to take responsibility for my child, whether you approve or not." Julian let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Responsibility?" He stepped closer. His towering presence meant to intimidate. "Do you even understand that word? You were born into privilege, into untouchable wealth. You have never had to fight for anything in your life. And now you think you can just throw it all away for some woman who saw an opportunity and took it?" Theodore clenched his fists. "That's not true. Amelie isn't after money. She didn't even know who I was when we met." Julian's expression darkened. "Then she got lucky, because now she's carrying a child with my name. And whether you realize it or not, that comes with power, and with power comes a price." Theodore shook his head, anger flickering in his eyes. "Not everything is about power and control, Dad. Not everything is a transaction. Some things, real things, are built on love, not manipulation." Julian's jaw tightened. "Love?" he scoffed, the word dripping with disdain. "You sound like your mother." Theodore's expression hardened. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." A thick silence settled over the room, heavy with unspoken truths. Julian took a step back, his face unreadable. Then, with deliberate precision, he pulled open a drawer in his desk. From within, he retrieved a sleek black leather folder and placed it on the polished surface. "Fine," he said, his voice cold as steel. "If you're so determined to throw away your future, then do it. But you will do it without my name. Without my money." Theodore's heart pounded in his chest. "What?" "I am cutting you off," Julian stated, his tone absolute, unyielding. "No more inheritance. No more access to Morgan Enterprises. From this moment on, you are no longer my son." The weight of those words crashed down on Theodore like a crushing force. For a fleeting moment, Julian thought he saw something flicker in his son's eyes. Pain, hesitation, doubt. But just as quickly, it vanished. Theodore squared his shoulders, lifting his chin in quiet defiance. "Fine," he said, his voice steady. "If that's what it takes to be a real man, then so be it. I'll prove to you that I don't need your money. I don't need any of this to build a life of my own." Julian smirked, shaking his head. "We'll see how long that lasts." Theodore said nothing more. He turned on his heel and strode out of the study, his footsteps echoing down the vast hallway like the final toll of a bell. Julian remained still, eyes locked on the closed door, long after his son had gone. This was necessary. There was no room for weakness in the Morgan family, no room for mistakes. And yet, as he turned back to the towering windows, gazing out at the empire he ruled, for the first time in years, the view felt hollow. The Morgan mansion had never seemed so empty. The grand hallways, once filled with purpose and movement, now resonated only with the fading sound of Theodore's retreating footsteps. Each step carried away the last shred of a bond that had been fragile for years, and yet Julian could not bring himself to call him back. "You are no longer my son." The words echoed in Theodore's mind, sharp, final, irrevocable. He clenched his fists, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had always known his father was ruthless, but this, severing him completely, even for Julian Morgan, it was more brutal than he had expected. He pushed open the heavy wooden door to his bedroom, a sanctuary that suddenly felt suffocating. The massive king-size bed, the custom furniture, the framed remnants of a life built on privilege. It all meant nothing now. He had minutes to pack. Knowing his father, security would be arriving soon to ensure his swift departure. Grabbing a duffel bag from the closet, he began stuffing clothes inside with rushed, erratic movements. How had everything unraveled so fast? Just yesterday, he had a future, a plan, maybe not one that aligned with his father's expectations, but at least something. Now, he had nothing. Nothing except Amélie. The thought of her steadied him. She was waiting for him in her small Austin apartment, the one she had hesitantly invited him into when their relationship was still new, still full of stolen moments and whispered dreams of what could be. He wouldn't let her down. A knock on the door made him freeze. Security, no doubt, but when he turned, it wasn't the uniformed guards he expected. It was his mother. Eleanor Morgan was the opposite of her husband in every way. Where Julian was steel and fire, Eleanor was warmth and quiet resilience. Her presence had been one of the few comforts of his childhood, yet even she had never been able to fully stand against his father's dominance. She stepped inside, her silk robe trailing behind her, concern etched into her delicate features. "Theodore?" she murmured, her voice tight. "I just spoke to your father. He told me what happened." Theodore exhaled sharply, shoving more clothes into his bag. "Then you know I have to go." Eleanor hesitated before stepping closer. "I don't agree with what he's doing," she admitted, lowering her voice. "But you know how he is. He sees this as betrayal, as weakness. She faltered, searching for the right words. "He doesn't know how to love unless it comes with conditions." Theodore zipped his bag and slung it over his shoulder. "Then I'm done trying to make him understand. I won't beg, Mom. I made my choice. Amélie and I are having this baby, whether he likes it or not." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "And what about you? How are you going to survive? You've never lived without this, without his money, without his protection. I don't want to see you struggle." Theodore forced a small smile. "Then I'll learn. The difference is, I won't become him." Eleanor's expression cracked, pain flickering through her features. Theodore knew how much she had endured under Julian's rule. A part of him wished she could escape too. She reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a sleek black envelope. "Take this," she said, extending it toward him. Theodore frowned, eyeing it warily. "What is it?" "A bank card." Theodore blinked as his mother extended a sleek black envelope toward him. "I opened an account in your name years ago in case something like this ever happened." His throat tightened. "Mom? I can't." "You can," she interrupted gently. "I know your pride, Theodore, but you're going to be a father. You have responsibilities now, and you need to think about Amélie and that baby first. Don't let your stubbornness take away your options." He hesitated, then reached for the envelope, fingers curling around it. He hated that he needed it, hated that accepting it felt like admitting defeat. But he wasn't just making decisions for himself anymore. Eleanor touched his cheek, her palm warm against his skin. "I love you. That won't change." A lump formed in his throat. He swallowed hard. "I love you too, Mom." Before either of them could say more, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Theodore turned just in time to see the security guards approaching. Of course, his father wouldn't even let him leave on his own terms. Eleanor stepped back, composing herself as the guards stopped at the doorway. Dawson, the lead guard, a man Theodore had known for years, gave a professional nod, though discomfort flickered in his eyes. "Mr. Morgan," Dawson said carefully, "your father has asked us to escort you off the premises." Theodore exhaled slowly, tightening his grip on the bag slung over his shoulder. "I was already leaving." He walked past them without another word, descending the grand staircase for the last time. The weight of finality pressed down on him with each step. The chandeliers overhead, the polished marble floors, the priceless artwork lining the walls. This had once been his world, but had it ever truly belonged to him? The front doors loomed ahead, massive mahogany slabs that had always symbolized power and exclusivity. Now they were simply a threshold he needed to cross. The butler opened them as he approached, and the night air hit him like a slap. The long driveway stretched before him, leading away from the only home he had ever known. At the end of it, his car sat waiting, the last thing still in his name. He glanced back only once. Julian Morgan stood at the top of the stairs, watching him. His expression was unreadable. Theodore didn't pause. He walked forward, step by step, until he reached his car. Tossing his bag into the passenger seat, he slid behind the wheel, fingers tightening around the steering wheel. This was it. A new life, no turning back. As he started the engine and pulled away, his phone buzzed on the console. Emily's name lit up the screen. He picked it up, bringing it to his ear. "Hey," he said, his voice softer now. "Hey," Emily replied. "Are you okay?" Theodore exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I will be." The Austin skyline glowed in the distance as Theodore navigated the dimly lit streets, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The drive had been long and silent, filled with thoughts that refused to settle, and the gnawing weight of uncertainty pressing against his chest. He was no longer Theodore Morgan, heir to an empire. He was just Theodore, a man trying to figure out his next steps. As he pulled into the small parking lot of Emily's apartment complex, the reality of his situation sank in. The building was modest, far from the luxury he had always known. But this was his life now, and if he was being honest, there was something freeing about that. He shut off the engine, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. The Texas air was thick and warm, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier in the evening. Slinging his bag over his shoulder, he made his way to Amelie's unit, his heart hammering harder than he wanted to admit. Before he could knock, the doors swung open. Emily stood there, hazel eyes filled with relief. Her long brown hair fell over her shoulders in loose waves, and she wore an oversized sweatshirt and leggings. Simple, effortless, beautiful. "You made it," she breathed, stepping aside to let him in. Theodore gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah, barely." The apartment was small, really small, but it radiated warmth. Cozy furniture, a few framed pictures on the walls, the lingering scent of vanilla and cinnamon in the air. It was nothing like the mansion he had left behind, and yet, somehow, it felt more like home than that place ever had. Emily closed the door behind him, watching him carefully. "How did it go?" Theodore set his bag down by the couch and ran a hand through his hair. "About as bad as you'd expect. He cut me off completely. No money, no inheritance, nothing." A hollow laugh escaped him. "I think he actually enjoyed it." Amelie frowned, stepping closer. "I'm so sorry, Theo." He shook his head. "Don't be. I knew this was coming." He glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of the stark contrast between his past and his present. I don't know how to do this." Mally reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "You don't have to do it alone." Her words settled something in him, grounding him in the moment. They sat down on the couch, and Theodore leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time in his life, the path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, it was his own. Emily studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You know you can stay here as long as you need," she said gently. Theodore nodded. "I appreciate that." She hesitated before adding, "But we also need to talk about what comes next. We're having a baby, Theo. We need a plan." He knew she was right. He couldn't just wing it and hope for the best. He needed a job, a steady income, a way to build something real, without his father's fortune behind him. "I'll find work," he said, determination creeping into his voice. "Something stable. It won't be easy, but I'll figure it out." Emily squeezed his hand. "We'll figure it out together." The next morning, Theodore woke earlier than expected, his body still adjusting to the unfamiliar surroundings. The couch had been uncomfortable, but the ache in his back barely registered. This was his first morning truly on his own. By the time Emily emerged from the bedroom, yawning as she tied her hair into a messy bun, he was already dressed, standing in the tiny kitchen, staring at the coffee maker as if it held the answers to his life. "You're up early," she noted, grabbing a mug. He turned, offering a small grin. "Figured I should get started on finding a job." She poured her coffee, watching him. "Any idea where you'll start?" He exhaled. "Not really, but I guess I'll take what I can get." Emily hesitated before setting her mug down. "I might have an idea." He raised a brow. "Yeah? There's a bakery not far from here. The owner, Mrs. Savannah, is always looking for help. It's nothing fancy, but you like baking and you're good at it." Theodore blinked. "You want me to work at a bakery?" She shrugged. "Why not? You always talk about how much you love making bread, and let's be honest, Theo, you need a job. This is a place where you won't have to deal with your father's world." He considered it. The idea of working at a small-town bakery was the exact opposite of everything he'd been raised for. He had spent his life learning to run a multi-billion-dollar corporation, not knead dough. But then again, wasn't that the point? Theodore nodded slowly. "Okay, let's check it out." An hour later, they arrived at Savannah's Bakery, a quaint little shop nestled between a bookstore and a flower shop. The scent of fresh bread and warm pastries drifted through the air, wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. For the first time in days, Theodore felt something settle inside him, something that almost felt like peace. Behind the counter, a woman in her 60s wiped her hands on her apron before looking up. Her sharp eyes softened with familiarity as she took in Amelie. "Well, if it isn't Amelie Foster," she teased. "What brings you here, sweetheart?" Amelie smiled. "Hi, Mrs. Savannah. I actually came to see if you're still looking for help." Mrs. Savannah raised a brow, glancing at Theodore. "You looking for work, honey?" He cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him, gaze assessing. "You ever worked in a bakery before?" Theodore hesitated. "Not exactly, but I can learn." Mrs. Savannah smirked. "You got strong hands? Know how to follow directions?" He chuckled. "I think so." She nodded. "All right then. Show up tomorrow morning at 5. We'll see what you're made of." Theodore blinked. 5 in the morning? Mrs. Savannah laughed. "Welcome to bakery life, sweetheart." Amelie squeezed his arm, grinning. "You're going to do great." As they left the shop, Theodore felt something stir in his chest. For the first time since walking away from his father's house, he didn't feel lost. This wasn't the future he had planned, but maybe, just maybe, it was the future he needed. The alarm blared at 4:30 a.m., jolting Theodore awake. His body protested immediately, muscles stiff from another night on Emily's couch, mind foggy with exhaustion. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. Then it all came rushing back. No mansion, no business meetings, no driver waiting outside to take him to a corporate office. Just him, Emily, and a bakery job he'd never imagined himself taking. He sat up, rubbing his face. The apartment was dark, the only sound the occasional hum of cars passing outside. Emily was still asleep in the bedroom, curled beneath the blankets. He resisted the urge to crawl back into the warmth with her. Not today. Not when he had something to prove. Quietly, he got dressed, jeans and a plain t-shirt, and grabbed his keys. As he slipped on his sneakers, his eyes caught a small sticky note on the kitchen counter. "You got this." "Mom." A small smile tugged at his lips. He folded the note, slipped it into his pocket, and stepped out into the early morning air. A new beginning. No turning back. By the time Theodore arrived at Savannah's Bakery, the sky was still dark, the streets eerily quiet. The shop's front windows glowed warmly against the dim morning. a stark contrast to the cold, lifeless boardrooms he was used to. He took a deep breath before pushing open the door. Inside, the scent of yeast, cinnamon, and freshly baked bread wrapped around him like an invisible embrace. Comforting. Unexpected, behind the counter, Mrs. Savannah was already at work, kneading dough with practiced ease. She barely glanced up. 5 on the dot. Good start, kid. Theodore forced a grin. Didn't think you'd actually be watching the clock. She smirked, wiping her hands on her apron. This business is all about timing. You show up late, you mess up the whole day. She gestured for him to follow her into the kitchen, where trays of pastries and loaves lined the metal counters. All right, she said, handing him an apron. Let's see what you can do. He tied it around his waist, suddenly hyper-aware of how out of place he felt. He had spent years mastering financial reports, strategic expansions, investment portfolios. None of that meant a damn thing in here. Mrs. Savannah dropped a lump of dough in front of him. First lesson, kneading. You ever done this before? He stared at the sticky mass in his hands. Not exactly. She chuckled. Didn't think so. Press with the heel of your palm, fold it over, press again, keep going. Theodore mimicked her movements, but his technique was stiff, awkward. The dough clung to his fingers, refusing to cooperate. Mrs. Savannah sighed. You're fighting it. He frowned. I'm trying to control it. She gave him a knowing look. That's your problem. Control. That was how he had been raised. Control everything, or everything controls you. But dough wasn't numbers on a spreadsheet. It didn't bend to formulas and strategies. It had a rhythm of its own, something he had to feel rather than force. Theodore took a breath and tried again, easing into the motion. This time, the dough moved more naturally beneath his hands. Mrs. Savannah watched him closely, then nodded in approval. Better. You keep that up and maybe you'll actually be useful around here. He huffed a small laugh. I'll take that as a compliment. They worked in silence, the steady rhythm of kneading and shaping filling the space between them. It was physical work, repetitive yet oddly satisfying. Hours passed in a blur of rolling, shaping, dusting, and baking. Theodore lost himself in the motions, in the heat of the ovens, in the quiet hum of the morning rush. By noon, he had flour in his hair, sweat on his brow, and an ache in his arms, but he also had a tray of perfectly golden croissants in front of him. Mrs. Savannah inspected them with a critical eye, then gave a small nod. Not bad for a first day. Theodore wiped his hands on a towel. So, does that mean I still have a job? She smirked. You show up tomorrow, we'll see. He grinned, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. It wasn't the kind of success he had chased his whole life, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. As he untied his apron, he noticed Amélie standing near the entrance, watching him with an amused smile. Look at you, she teased as he approached. Covered in flour and actually looking happy? Theodore chuckled. It's weird, right? She tilted her head. Not really. I think it suits you. They stepped outside together, the Texas sun hot against their skin. So, she asked, nudging his shoulder, what did you think? Theodore looked down at his hands, still dusted with flour, then out at the city around him. It's not what he hesitated before finishing, expected, but maybe that's a good thing. Molly smiled. I have a feeling this is just the beginning. Theodore felt it too. Maybe this wasn't just about survival. Maybe it was about building something real. Not just a job, not just a paycheck, but a future. And for the first time since leaving his father's house, that future didn't feel impossible. It felt like his. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon filled the air as the bakery door swung open, welcoming the first wave of customers. The early morning rush was a ritual at Savannah's bakery, a steady stream of regulars, each with their own favorite pastry, their own routine, their own stories. Theodore had been working here for almost 2 weeks now, and though his body still ached from the relentless early mornings, something about the rhythm of it all felt right. There was predictability in the way dough rose, in the way the ovens hummed, in the way customers always smiled when they took the first bite of something warm and sweet. And for the first time in a long time, Theodore wasn't just watching from the outside, he was part of it. It was nothing like the chaotic, high-pressure world he had left behind, and yet, this mattered in a way he had never expected. The bell above the door jingled, signaling another customer. Theodore looked up from the counter just as Mrs. Savannah stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "All right, Morgan," she said, her sharp eyes assessing him. "Time for a test." Theodore brushed flour from his hands. "A test?" she smirked. "You've been here long enough. Let's see if you can handle making the bakery's bestseller on your own." His stomach twisted slightly. He had spent days learning the recipes, kneading dough, working alongside Mrs. Savannah and the other employees, trying to keep up. But now, on his own? She crossed her arms. "You up for it, or are you going to choke? A challenge." A small grin tugged at his lips. "What am I making?" "Cinnamon rolls. From scratch. No help." Theodore exhaled. He had helped with the cinnamon rolls before, but Mrs. Savannah had always been there, watching, correcting, making sure he didn't screw it up. This time, it was all on him. From the corner of the shop, Amelie sat at a small table, sipping her coffee. When he glanced at her, she gave him an encouraging nod. Theodore turned back to Mrs. Savannah. "All right, let's do this," she gestured toward the prep station. "Clock's ticking, kid." He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Carefully, he measured out the ingredients from memory. Flour, sugar, yeast, eggs, milk, butter, cinnamon, brown sugar. Simple enough. But the real challenge wasn't in the ingredients, it was in the process. Baking wasn't just throwing things together and hoping for the best, it was patience, precision. The dough came together under his hands. Sticky at first, too sticky. He added a little more flour, kneading against the cool countertop, working it until it became smooth and elastic. Mrs. Savannah watched, her expression unreadable. Theodore focused. Press, fold, press, let the dough breathe, let it take shape. When it was ready, he rolled it out into a perfect rectangle, spread the softened butter evenly across the surface, then dusted it with cinnamon and brown sugar. He remembered the first time he had done this. Too much filling, a mess everywhere. This time, he got it right. He rolled the dough into a tight log, sliced it into spirals, each one nearly identical in size. As the rolls baked, the warm scent of cinnamon filled the air. Standing by the oven, arms crossed, Theodore watched through the glass as the dough rose, turning golden brown, and when he finally pulled the tray out, he felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Pride. Not because it was a multi-million-dollar deal, not because he had just closed an important contract, but because he had made something with his own hands. And it was good. Mrs. Savannah inspected the cinnamon rolls, then nodded. "Not bad." Theodore smirked. "I'll take it." She glanced at him. "Still a long way to go, but you're better than you were when you walked through that door." He let out a small laugh. "That's a pretty low bar." She chuckled. "Maybe, but you're proving you can handle real work. That's more than I can say for most people who come in here looking for a job." The words hit harder than he expected. For so long his worth had been measured in money, power, influence, but now he was earning respect for something real. Mrs. Savannah patted his shoulder. "All right, enough standing around. Get back to work." Theodore nodded and stepped behind the counter just as the morning rush began. By noon, the crowd had thinned, leaving behind the scent of fresh bread and coffee. Theodore leaned against the counter, exhausted but satisfied. Emily walked up and set a cup of coffee in front of him. "You survived," she teased. Theodore chuckled, taking a sip. "Barely." She tilted her head. "You know, I think you actually like this." He exhaled, considering it. For years, he had chased a future that had never quite fit, always trying to meet his father's impossible expectations, always feeling like he was never enough. But here, covered in flour, standing in a tiny bakery in a city his father had never cared about, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. At peace. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I do." Emily smiled. "Then maybe this isn't just a job. Maybe it's something more." Theodore glanced around the bakery. The warmth of it, the quiet hum of conversation, the scent of cinnamon still lingering in the air. The faces of customers, content, and at ease. Maybe Amelie was right. Maybe this was more than just a job. Maybe it was the beginning of something real. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of that. Julian Morgan sat alone in his expansive office, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view had always been a source of pride, a testament to the empire he had built with his own hands. Every deal, every decision, every sacrifice had been made to ensure his name carried weight, to secure a legacy that would outlast him. And yet, Tonight, as he sat in the dim glow of his study, a glass of whiskey in hand, that legacy felt hollow. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Theodore had walked out of his life. 2 weeks since his son had turned his back on everything Julian had built. Julian had expected rage, anger, that Theodore would realize his mistake and come crawling back the moment he understood how brutal life was without wealth, without influence, without power. But that phone call never came. There had been no desperate messages, no attempts to negotiate, no plea for forgiveness. Theodore was truly gone. Julian swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching his reflection in the darkened window. He looked older than he remembered. The sharp lines of his face, once so unshakable, now seemed weighed down by something heavier than time. The mansion had been too quiet since Theodore left. Eleanor still moved through the halls like a ghost. She hadn't spoken much to him since that night. Not in anger, no, that would have been easier. Instead, there was only silence, a quiet, lingering disappointment. She had always been the bridge between father and son, the steady force that kept their fractured relationship from collapsing completely. But now, that bridge was gone. Julian set his drink down, running a hand through his graying hair. He had spent his entire life in control, his business, his employees, his fortune, even his family. Yet here he was, unable to control the one thing that mattered most. With a frustrated sigh, he pulled out his phone, hesitating for only a second before tapping his assistant's contact. The line clicked. A crisp, professional voice filled the silence. "Yes, Mr. Morgan? Find out where Theodore is," he ordered, his voice firm despite the hesitation curling in his chest. A pause. Then, "Sir? Are you sure? I thought—" "Just do it," Julian snapped, then hung up. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Maybe he needed proof that Theodora was struggling, that he had made a mistake, that life without the Morgan name was unbearable. Or maybe, just maybe, he needed to know his son was okay. The thought made his chest tighten. He wasn't ready to confront what that meant. The next morning, Julian arrived at his office earlier than usual. His assistant was already waiting, a folder in hand. "I have the information you requested," she said, passing it to him. Julian hesitated before flipping it open. His eyes scanned the contents: an address in Austin, Texas, a small apartment complex, a place called Savannah's Bakery. He frowned. "A bakery?" His assistant nodded. "It seems Theodore has been working there for the past couple of weeks." Julian sat back, staring at the report. Theodore. Working in a bakery. His son had grown up with private chefs, luxury vacations, the finest education money could buy. The idea of him covered in flour, waking at dawn to bake bread, serving customers like some ordinary worker, it was absurd. And yet, he was doing it. Julian's fingers tightened around the folder. This should have been proof of Theodore's failure. But instead, it felt like proof of something else entirely. He closed the folder abruptly. "I'll be out for the day," he announced. His assistant barely concealed her surprise, but nodded. "Understood, sir." Julian left the office and stepped into his car, instructing the driver to take him to the airport. The entire flight to Texas passed in silence, his thoughts tangled in a knot he couldn't untie. He didn't know exactly what he would say when he saw Theodore. Would he demand his son come home? Offer him a second chance? Or was this just curiosity, a need to see with his own eyes the life Theodore had chosen over him? By the time the car pulled up outside Savannah's Bakery, the afternoon sun had begun casting long shadows on the pavement. Julian stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks as he took in the modest storefront. It was nothing like the world he knew. No flashing signs, no grandeur, just a simple, inviting shop, the scent of fresh bread and coffee spilling onto the sidewalk. Through the window he saw him. Theodore, wearing an apron, moving behind the counter with a quiet confidence that sent a jolt through Julian's chest. He wasn't just working, he looked happy. Mrs. Savannah said something to him, and Theodore laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that Julian hadn't heard in years. Then, Amelie appeared. She carried a small tray of pastries, her free hand resting on the soft curve of her stomach. Theodore turned to her, his smile easy, warm, content in a way Julian had never seen before. Julian's throat tightened. This was the moment he had imagined for years, watching his son struggle, watching him realize his mistake, waiting for him to come crawling back. But this wasn't that. The Theodore wasn't struggling. He wasn't lost. He was thriving. And for the first time, Julian Morgan was the one standing on the outside looking in. His grip tightened on the door handle. His instincts screamed at him to push inside, to demand Theodore listen, to remind him of who he was, of everything he had thrown away. But instead, Julian let go. He took a step back, then another, and then he turned and walked away. For the first time in his life, Julian Morgan didn't know what to do. The afternoon rush at Savannah's bakery was in full swing. The scent of cinnamon and fresh bread filled the air, the quiet hum of conversation weaving between the clatter of plates and steaming cups of coffee. Theodore moved through the space with practiced ease, his hands working methodically, his mind focused. 2 weeks ago, he had felt like an outsider, unsure of himself in this new world. Now, it felt different. He wasn't just getting by, he was part of something. Mrs. Savannah glanced at him as he slid a tray of croissants into the display case. You're getting faster, she noted. Theodore grinned. I had a good teacher, she smirked. Damn right you did. By the window, Emily sat with a cup of tea, one hand resting lightly on her growing belly. She had been coming in every afternoon, keeping him company between shifts at the bookstore. Their baby would be here in a few months, and the thought of it filled Theodore with a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the future. Everything felt right. And then the door opened. The bell jingled softly. A new customer. Theodore looked up out of habit, his hands still tying a bag of pastries for an elderly woman at the counter. And then he froze. Standing just inside the door, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable, Julian Morgan. The breath left Theodore's lungs. The bakery felt smaller, quieter, like the air had been sucked from the room. His father. Here. For a split second, Theodore thought he was imagining it, that exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. But no, Julian was really there, standing in his perfectly tailored suit, looking completely out of place among the warmth of the bakery. It had been weeks since Theodore had last seen him, since the night he walked out of the mansion for good, since his father had disowned him. And now here he was. The bag of pastries nearly slipped from Theodore's fingers. Across the shop, Amelie went still. Mrs. Savannah, ever perceptive, sensed the shift in the air. Her gaze flickered between the two men before settling on the one by the door. You know him? She asked quietly. The Theodore swallowed, forcing himself to breathe. Yeah, he said, his voice rough. That's my father. Mrs. Savannah's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing. She simply stepped aside, giving him the space to handle whatever this was. Theodore wiped his hands on his apron and took a step toward Julian, his heart hammering, his mind racing. What are you doing here? His voice was sharp but controlled. Julian studied him for a long moment, his piercing blue eyes taking in everything. The flour dusted on his shirt, the apron tied around his waist, the way he stood behind the counter like he belonged there. It was clear he hadn't expected this. Finally, his father spoke. I was in town. Theodore scoffed. Right, because you just happened to be in Austin? Happened to walk into this bakery? Julian's jaw tensed. I wanted to see how you were doing. Theodore let out a bitter laugh. You mean you wanted to see if I had failed yet? Silence across the room. Ami was watching, her fists clenched on her lap. Julian's gaze flickered toward her, then lower, to her stomach. Something in his expression shifted so fast that Theodore almost missed it. Julian wasn't just seeing Ami this time, he was seeing his grandson. The thought sent a ripple of uncertainty through Theodore. Why was Julian really here? If he had come to gloat, to remind Theodore that he had made a mistake, then why did he look so hesitant? Julian's voice broke the silence. You seem to be doing well. Theodore narrowed his eyes. Would that disappoint you? His father exhaled, his expression unreadable. No. Theodore wasn't sure if he believed that. For years, he had lived under Julian's shadow, measuring himself against impossible expectations. But standing here now, face to face, he felt something new. He felt free. Julian still had his wealth, his empire, his control. But he no longer had control over Theodore, and Julian knew it. The realization hit Theodore hard. He didn't need his father's approval. He didn't need his father's money. He had built something for himself, and Julian had come all this way to see it. Theodore took a step back, shaking his head. "If you came here to tell me I made a mistake, save your breath. I'm not going back." Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice lower than before, he said, "I never said you made a mistake." Theodore froze. For a split second. He saw something in his father's eyes. Something unfamiliar. Something he had never seen before. Regret. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. Julian straightened, slipping back into the man Theodore had always known, the untouchable businessman, the father who never showed weakness. "I should go," Julian said. "I just wanted to see for myself." Theodore let out a breath, his body still tense. "Yeah, I bet you did." Julian hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like he wanted to say something else, but instead he just nodded once and turned toward the door. Right before stepping outside, he paused. Without looking back, he said, "Your mother asks about you." Then he was gone. The bell jingled softly as the door swung shut behind him. Theodore stood frozen, his mind racing, his chest tight. "Across the shop," Emily finally spoke. "Theodore?" But he couldn't answer, because, for the first time, he had seen a crack in his father's armor. And he wasn't sure what that meant. Even after Julian had left, Theodore could still feel the tension coiled inside him. The door had swung shut, but the weight of that encounter lingered, pressing down like an invisible force. He turned back toward the counter, but the usual ease with which he moved through the bakery was gone. His hands felt stiff, his mind restless. Why had Julian really come? What had he expected to find? More importantly, why hadn't he said more? Theodore had braced himself for the usual Morgan brand arrogance, the sharp-edged remarks, the disapproving glances, the not-so-subtle demands to admit his mistake and return to the life he'd abandoned. But Julian hadn't done any of that. Instead, he had looked at their child, and for a fleeting moment, Theodore had seen something in his father's face that caught him completely off guard. Doubt, regret. He dragged a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. Emily walked over, her expression careful. She had been watching the whole time, and Theodore could tell she was gauging him, waiting before she spoke. "That was unexpected," she said finally. Theodore let out a dry laugh. "You think?" She crossed her arms. "He looked different. Not how I imagined." Theodore shook his head. "He's good at that. Walking in, making you think one thing, then leaving before you even figure out what just happened." She studied him for a moment, then reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "Are you okay?" Theodore wanted to say yes, to brush it off like it didn't matter, but it did. Because for years his father had been an immovable force. Julian Morgan was a man who never wavered, never looked back. Yet, today, he had. Theodore sighed. "I don't know." Amélie nodded as if she understood. And maybe she did. "Are you going to talk to him?" she asked hesitantly. Theodore hesitated. His instinct was to say no, to shut that door just as Julian had once shut him out, but the words, "Your mother asks about you," echoed in his mind. His mother. He hadn't spoken to her since he left, not because he didn't want to, but because he was afraid. Would she blame him, try to convince him to come back? Or worse, would she be disappointed in him? "I don't know," he admitted. "I wasn't expecting any of this." Molly squeezed his arm gently. "You don't have to figure it out right now." He nodded, though his mind was already tangled in a storm of thoughts. The rest of the afternoon dragged. Theodore tried to focus, but his rhythm was off. He made small mistakes, nearly overbaking a batch of bread, forgetting an order at the register. Even Mrs. Savannah noticed. By the time his shift ended, he was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work. When he and Amélie returned to their apartment, the first thing Theodore did was collapse onto the couch. He stared at the ceiling, trying to untangle the mess in his head. Amélie sat beside him, pulling her legs up onto the cushion. She didn't press him to talk, but he could feel her waiting, giving him space. After a long silence, Theodore finally spoke. "You know, my whole life, I've been chasing his approval. Even when I told myself I didn't care, I did. Amélie listened quietly. And now that I finally broke free, now that I'm actually happy, he suddenly shows up? She leaned her head against his shoulder. Maybe he's realizing he made a mistake, Theodore scoffed. Julian Morgan doesn't make mistakes. Amélie lifted her head and gave him a pointed look. Are you sure about that? Theodore hesitated. Because… No. He wasn't sure anymore. His father had been so certain when he severed ties, so convinced that Theodore would crumble, that he'd come crawling back the moment reality set in. But that hadn't happened, and now it was Julian who had shown up unannounced, standing in a bakery that was worlds away from the empire he had built, watching his son like he was a stranger, like he no longer recognized the man standing before him. Amélie reached for Theodore's hand, her fingers lacing through his in a quiet show of support. What if this is the beginning of something different? She asked gently. What if he's finally realizing he was wrong? Theodore exhaled, his jaw tightening. I don't know if I care anymore. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. He did care. More than he wanted to admit, that was the real problem. Caring had never brought him anything but disappointment. And after everything, he wasn't sure if he could afford to let himself hope. Just as he was about to say something else, his phone buzzed against the table, the vibration cutting through the silence. Instinctively, he reached for it, expecting nothing more than a routine notification, perhaps a reminder for work or an email from the bank. But the moment he saw the name on the screen, his stomach clenched. Amélie caught the shift in his expression immediately. Is it him? She asked quietly. The Theodore shook his head, his thumb hovering uncertainly over the screen. No, it's my mother. A rush of emotions flooded him all at once. He hadn't spoken to her since he left, not because he didn't want to, but because the thought of hearing her voice, of facing whatever she might say, had terrified him. Had she been waiting for him to reach out first, hoping he'd change his mind? Or had she only called because Julian told her about today? Amélie gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. You don't have to answer. But Theodore already knew he would, because this was his mother. And despite everything, despite the past, despite the anger, despite the distance, he missed her. Taking a deep breath, he swiped the screen and lifted the phone to his ear. Hey, Mom. For a moment, all he heard was silence. Then, at last, her voice, soft, familiar, and yet tinged with something heavier than before. Theodore. His chest tightened. And just like that, everything became even more complicated. Theodore gripped the phone tighter as his mother's voice filled his ear. It had been weeks since he had heard her speak, but the sound was like a portal to another time. In an instant, he was a child again, back in the safety of her arms, back in the memory of nights when she whispered promises that everything would be okay. But now, there was no such reassurance. Instead, there was hesitation. Mom, he said again, his voice uncertain, unsure of where this conversation would lead. There was a long pause before she spoke, as if she were carefully weighing each word. I didn't think you'd answer, she admitted gently. Theodore exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. Yeah, well, I almost didn't. I wouldn't have blamed you, she said softly. Not after everything. Another silence stretched between them. Amélie sat beside him on the couch, watching him carefully, not speaking, just waiting, letting him take the moment at his own pace. The older swallowed hard, then spoke again. Dad told you he came to see me. It wasn't a question, Eleanor sighed, the sound laced with exhaustion. Theodore clenched his jaw. Of course Julian would have told her. He had spent years controlling the narrative, ensuring that every decision Theodore made was never truly his own. That even when Theodore walked away, Julian still held the power to shape the story. He said you're working in a bakery, Eleanor continued after a moment. That you and Amélie are doing well? Her voice wavered slightly, carrying something Theodore hadn't expected. Not judgment, not disappointment. Hesitation, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to acknowledge that he was happy outside of the Morgan legacy. Theodore glanced around the apartment. The modest furniture, the small but warm space he and Amélie were building together. It was nothing like the world he had grown up in, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to justify it. We are, he said simply, Silence, then, so softly that he almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "I'm glad." Theodore's breath caught in his chest. He had expected her to try to convince him to come home, to tell him he had made a mistake. But she hadn't, and somehow that made everything even more difficult. She was glad. The words settled uncomfortably in Theodore's chest, like a weight pressing down on him. He shifted slightly, trying to shake the unease creeping up his spine. "So, is that why you called?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "To check in?" A pause. Then, when his mother spoke again, her tone had changed. Lower now, more serious, laced with something he couldn't quite place. "No, Theodore," she said quietly. "I called because there's something you need to know." A flicker of unease sparked in his gut. His grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. On the other end of the line, he heard his mother take a deep breath, as if preparing herself. "It's about Emily." The moment the words left her mouth, Theodore felt every muscle in his body tense. His heart stuttered, then picked up speed. Beside him, Emily, who had been silent until now, immediately straightened, alert. His voice came out sharper than intended. "What about her?" There was a hesitation, brief but heavy. Then, finally, his mother spoke. "I knew her mother." For a moment, Theodore thought he had misheard. He blinked. "What?" Eleanor let out a slow, measured sigh. "A long time ago, before your father built the business into what it is today, he had a handful of trusted employees. Among them was a woman named Linda Foster. She was diligent, hardworking, and fiercely loyal. I remember her well." Theodore's pulse quickened. The name meant nothing to him, but when he glanced at Emily, he saw the way her face had drained of color. "Emily's mother?" he asked, his mind racing to connect the dots. "What does that have to do with anything?" His mother hesitated again. When she spoke, there was something almost regretful in her voice. "One day, Linda was fired," she said. "It happened suddenly, no explanation, no warning. No one understood why. But later I found out the truth. It was your father's decision." A slow, cold chill crept down Theodora's spine. Julian. Of course, his father had always been ruthless in business, always making decisions that served his own interests, no matter who got caught in the crossfire. But before Theodore could say a word, Eleanor continued. "It wasn't until I started asking questions that I realized how unfair it was," she said. "Linda had done nothing wrong, but your father, he accused her of stealing from the company. I don't know if it was true or if he simply needed an excuse to get rid of her, but the moment she was fired, she vanished." Theodore's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. "You're telling me," he said slowly, his voice dangerously calm, "that my father destroyed Emily's mother's life?" Emily inhaled sharply beside him, her breathing suddenly unsteady. Without thinking, Theodore reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "I don't know the full story," Eleanor admitted, "but, Theodore, I think you need to find out." Theodore's teeth clenched, his mind raced, the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed beginning to take shape. "Why didn't you stop him?" he asked, his voice rougher now. His mother's breath hitched slightly before she answered. "You know how he is." And that was the truth, wasn't it? Julian Morgan made decisions and no one questioned him. Not his employees, not his son, not even his wife. But Theodore wasn't that person anymore. He wasn't a child blindly following his father's lead. He wasn't under Julian's control. And now, knowing that Emily's mother had been one of his father's casualties, something inside him burned with a quiet, simmering rage. Emily abruptly stood, her movements sharp, restless. Theodore could see the turmoil in her expression, the way she struggled to process it all. "Amélie," he said gently. She shook her head. "I need some air." Before he could say another word, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside, the door clicking shut behind her. Theodore watched her go, his chest tightening. His mother's voice pulled him back. "Theodore," she said softly, "I don't know what you're thinking right now, but please, be careful. Your father, he doesn't like losing control." A humorless laugh escaped him. "Yeah, I know." Another silence stretched between them. Then, when she spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. "I love you, Theodore. I always have." His throat tightened. He closed his eyes, letting the words sink in, unexpected and unguarded. "I love you too, Mom," he murmured, and then the call ended. For a long time, Theodore sat there, staring at the phone in his hands. His mother's words echoed in his mind, refusing to settle. Linda Foster, fired by Julian Morgan, accused of stealing, disappeared. Amelie's mother. He had spent his entire life running from his father's shadow, determined to carve out a future that belonged to him alone. But now, standing at the edge of a truth that could change everything, he wasn't sure if he had ever truly escaped. But no matter how far he ran, Julian always found a way to entangle himself in the story, like a thread woven through fabric, impossible to remove without unraveling everything. And now the woman he loved, the mother of his child, was caught in that same darkness. Theodore exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as his pulse pounded in his ears. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of it all. He needed to talk to Amelie, to tell her that no matter what, they would face this together. But when he turned, she was gone. A jolt of panic shot through him. He pushed himself up from the couch and rushed outside. The evening air was cool, the soft rustling of trees filling the quiet. His gaze swept across the dimly lit sidewalk until he found her, standing near the edge of the apartment complex, arms wrapped around herself, staring blankly at the street. She looked small, isolated, and yet, somehow, unreachable. Theodore approached cautiously. "Amélie?" he called gently. She didn't turn. "I just needed a minute," he hesitated, watching the way her shoulders tensed, the weight of this new truth pressing down on her. Then, carefully, he stepped closer. "I know," he said, "but I don't want you to go through this alone." A short, bitter laugh escaped her lips. She shook her head. "Alone, Theodora," she murmured, her voice laced with something sharp. "My entire life has been built on a lie. My mother never told me anything about this, never mentioned your father, never said a word about why she lost her job. All these years I thought she was just struggling, like so many single mothers do." She exhaled shakily. "But now..." Finally she turned to face him, her hazel eyes filled with pain, with uncertainty. "Now? I don't know what to think." Theodore swallowed against the tightness in his throat. He wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that the past was the past and they were building something better. But the truth was, it did matter. His father had destroyed too many lives, and now, that same past had come back, wrapping its cold fingers around the future they were trying so desperately to create. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure this out," he said, voice steady, "together." Emily held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. But something lingered in her expression. Something unresolved. Something fragile. And deep down, Theodore knew she was right. This wasn't over. The next morning, at Savannah's bakery, Theodore buried himself in work, trying to push aside the weight pressing against his chest. He kneaded dough with more force than necessary, shaping pastries, filling orders, anything to keep his hands moving, to stop his mind from spiraling. But no matter how hard he tried, the thoughts wouldn't fade. Julian had left destruction in his wake, like a storm that never truly passed. And now, for better or worse, Theodore and Amelie were standing in its path. But no matter how hard he worked, the feeling wouldn't go away. The weight in his chest, the unease coiling in his stomach. It lingered, refusing to be kneaded away, like the dough beneath his hands. Mrs. Savannah noticed. "You're going to tear that dough apart if you keep at it like that," she muttered as she passed by, raising a knowing eyebrow. Theodore forced a smirk. "Just trying to make sure it's perfect." She studied him for a beat, arms crossing over her flour-dusted apron. "This wouldn't have anything to do with that fancy-dressed man who walked in here yesterday, would it?" His stomach tightened. He hadn't told her about Julian, hadn't wanted to, but Mrs. Savannah was sharp. Nothing escaped her notice. He sighed, shaking his head. "It's complicated," she snorted. "Life always is." Wiping her hands on her apron, she leaned against the counter. "But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the past has a funny way of showing up when you least expect it." Theodore stared down at the dough in front of him, her words settling over him like a weight. And then, the front door swung open. The bell jingled, a harmless sound, ordinary, but something about it sent a shiver down his spine. A man walked in. Tall, sharp-featured, dressed in an expensive suit that had no place in a small-town bakery. Everything about him felt wrong. Theodore knew him instantly. Harris Denton, one of his father's men, his blood ran cold. Mrs. Savannah must have sensed the shift in the air because she turned toward the newcomer, eyes narrowing. "You lost, sweetheart." Harris barely spared her a glance. His gaze locked onto Theodore with unsettling precision. "We need to talk." Theodore wiped his hands on a towel and stepped forward, jaw tight. "We don't have anything to talk about." Harris smirked, pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "Your father disagrees." Theodore exhaled slowly, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I don't care what my father thinks." Harris tilted his head slightly, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I think you might. Especially once you find out that your little bakery is in trouble." Theodore's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" Harris tapped the business card against the counter. "Health inspectors. Someone tipped them off about violations in the kitchen." He cast a slow glance around the shop, feigning sympathy. Would be a shame if Savannah's bakery had to shut down over some unexpected findings. Theodore's stomach clenched. This wasn't a warning. It was a move. A calculated strike. Julian was pulling strings, orchestrating his downfall from a distance, unraveling everything Theodore had built piece by piece. Mrs. Savannah scoffed, unimpressed. "I run a damn clean bakery. There's nothing to find." Harris shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. But when the right people start asking the wrong questions, things have a way of getting complicated." The rage inside Theodore burned hotter, a storm gathering force. This wasn't about control anymore. This was about destruction. He stepped forward, voice low and measured. "Tell my father that if he wants to come after me, he can do it to my face." Harris didn't so much as blink. Instead, he smiled, as if Theodore's defiance was amusing. "Sweetheart," he said, "you'll come to him." He reached for a loaf of bread from the display, turned it over in his hands, then placed it back down with a quiet finality, one way or another. And with that, he walked out, leaving behind only silence and the sharp, lingering scent of unspoken threats. Theodore stared at the business card on the counter, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Mrs. Savannah crossed her arms. That was bad. Theodore dragged a hand down his face, exhaling through his nose. "Yeah." At that moment, Emily stepped out from the back, taking one look at his face before frowning. "What happened?" Theodore clenched his fists, his gaze still locked on the door Harris had just walked through. "My father just made his move." And if Julian thought he could scare him into coming back, he was dead wrong. Theodore wasn't running anymore. This time, he was fighting back. Theodore had spent most of his life playing by his father's rules, following expectations, meeting impossible standards, living under the crushing weight of a last name that dictated his every move. But not anymore. Standing in the heart of Savannah's bakery, staring at the business card Harris Denton had left behind, he felt something shift inside him. A slow burning anger, a refusal to be controlled. Julian Morgan thought he could scare him, thought he could pull strings and force him back into line, but he was wrong. A gentle hand touched his arm. "Theodore, what did he mean about the bakery being in trouble?" Amelie asked softly. Theodore exhaled, fingers curling around the edge of the counter. "It's a power play. My father wants me to crawl back, and he thinks the easiest way to do that is by taking away everything I have left." Mrs. Savannah, who had been silently observing, scoffed. "That man can go to hell. This bakery has been running longer than his fancy business. He thinks he can shut me down?" She gestured around the shop. "I built this place with my own hands. I don't scare easy." Theodore smirked. "Yeah, I figured." Mrs. Savannah crossed her arms. "So what are we dealing with? Fake violations? Fines? Bribes?" Theodore sighed. "Most likely, if my father wants something to happen, he finds a way. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." Mrs. Savannah's lips pressed into a firm line. "Then we won't make it easy for him." Theodore nodded, but his mind was already racing. How far would his father take this? If Julian wanted to, he could have the bakery shut down permanently. He had the money, the lawyers, and the influence to make it disappear overnight. And if that happened, Theodore wouldn't just be losing a job, he'd be losing his future. Their future. Emily, who had been quiet for too long, finally spoke. Her voice was steady. "Then we fight back." Theodore turned to her, surprised by the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just saying it to reassure him. She meant it. "This bakery is important to you," she continued, "to us. We're not going to let your father take that away." Something stirred deep in his chest. Emily had always been strong, but this was different. This was war, and they were in it together. That night, Theodore couldn't sleep. His mind wouldn't stop racing, running through every possible way his father could sabotage them. If Julian was willing to play dirty, Theodore had to be one step ahead. Finally, unable to stay still, he grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There was only one person who might have answers. He hesitated, then pressed call. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Theodore?" he exhaled. "Hey, Mom." Eleanor's voice softened. "I was hoping you'd call." Theodore sat on the edge of the bed, his voice low. "Tell me the truth. How far will he go?" His mother sighed, as if she had been expecting the question. "Theodore, you know your father. He doesn't like losing control." His jaw tightened. "Yeah, I figured. But this isn't just about me anymore," he said. "He's coming after people who have nothing to do with this. He's trying to ruin lives just to get to me." Eleanor was silent for a long moment. Then, she said something that chilled him to the core. "This isn't the—" She hesitated, then spoke again, her voice quieter. "This isn't the first time he's done something like this." Theodore's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" Eleanor hesitated again, and when she finally spoke, her words sent a shiver down his spine. Linda Foster wasn't the only one. His stomach twisted. Who else? There were others. Employees who got too close, people who asked too many questions, people who tried to fight back. She let out a shaky breath. "Your father doesn't destroy people all at once, Theodore. He does it slowly. He makes them think they can win, then he takes everything." Theodore closed his eyes. This was bigger than him. Julian had been doing this for years, silencing people, controlling them, ruining them. And if Theodore didn't stop him, Savannah's bakery would be next. "I have to end this," he muttered. His mother's voice was almost sad. "I know." A new determination settled in his chest. Julian wanted to destroy everything Theodore had built? Fine. Theodore would burn down everything his father had built instead. The next morning, he arrived at the bakery before sunrise. Mrs. Savannah was already there, unlocking the door as he walked up. She glanced at him. "You look like you haven't slept." He smirked. "Haven't?" She pushed the door open, stepping inside. "That means you've got a plan." He followed her in, rolling up his sleeves. "Yeah, but we need to move fast." A few minutes later, Amelie walked in, looking at both of them curiously. "What's going on?" Theodore turned to her, eyes burning with resolve. "We're going to expose him." Amelie frowned. "Your father?" Theodore nodded. "He's been doing this for years. Blackmail, sabotage, ruining lives just to keep control. If we fight him the way he expects, we'll lose, so we're going to hit him where it hurts." Mrs. Savannah raised an eyebrow. "And where's that?" A smirk tugged at Theodore's lips. "His reputation?" Julian Morgan was a master manipulator. He ruled through fear and power, but there was one thing he couldn't afford to lose: his public image. If they could gather real, undeniable proof of his crimes, the blackmail, the ruined careers, everything he'd done to silence people, then even he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it. Amelie crossed her arms. "And how exactly do we get that proof?" Theodore's smirk widened. "I know exactly where to start." Amelie tilted her head. "Where?" He leaned against the counter. "My mother." Clara Morgan had been trapped in Julian's world for decades, but she wasn't blind. She had seen things, heard things that could destroy him if they ever came to light. And now, for the first time, she was willing to talk. This wasn't just about saving the bakery anymore. This was about ending Julian Morgan's reign for good. Theodore clenched his fists, his mind sharper than it had ever been. His father had started this war. Now, Theodore was going to finish it. Theodore sat outside the bakery, his phone gripped tightly in his hand. The early morning air was crisp. The sun, barely beginning to rise over the quiet streets of Austin today, was the day his mother had agreed to meet him. After years of watching Julian destroy lives, Clara Morgan had finally reached her breaking point. Theodore could still hear the hesitation in her voice from their last call. "There are things I know, Theodore. Things that could change everything. He hadn't needed to ask twice. Now, waiting for her to arrive, he could feel the weight of what was coming pressing down on him. If she really had the proof he needed, if she was finally ready to speak out, there would be no turning back. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. Theodore stood as the door opened and Clara Morgan stepped out. Her designer sunglasses shielded her eyes, her tailored coat wrapped around her like armor. She had always been elegant, poised, a woman who carried the weight of being Julian Morgan's wife without ever letting the cracks show. But today, something was different. Today she looked tired. She walked toward him with measured steps, stopping just short of the patio table. Theodore studied her carefully. "You came?" Clara let out a quiet breath. "Of course I did." They sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It had been too long since they'd last seen each other, too much left unsaid. Finally, Clara reached into her purse and pulled out a small black folder. She placed it on the table between them, her manicured fingers resting lightly on top of it. "This," she said softly, "is everything I know." Theodore hesitated before picking up the folder. It felt heavier than it should have. Inside he found documents, old reports, letters, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even realized he was missing. "There are records in there," Clara continued, "of payoffs your father made, not just to employees, but to lawyers, investigators, anyone who could have posed a problem for him." Theodore flipped through the pages, his stomach twisting with each new revelation. Linda Foster's name was there. Her firing hadn't been a coincidence. His father had orchestrated it, fabricating evidence to make it look like she was stealing, then making sure no one questioned it. And worse, there were others. Names he didn't recognize, but whose stories were painfully familiar. Employees who had gotten too close to the truth. People whose lives had been quietly destroyed. Just like Amelie's mother. Theodore's hands clenched into fists. His father had been doing this for years, and he had gotten away with it until now. Clara watched him carefully. "I don't know what you plan to do with this, Theodore, but once you go down this path, there's no undoing it." Theodore met her gaze, his voice steady. "I don't want to undo it," his mother exhaled, shaking her head. "I used to tell myself he was just protecting his business, that he was doing what was necessary." She looked away, her voice softer now. "But that was a lie, wasn't it?" Theodore didn't answer. He didn't need to. Clara nodded to herself, as if finally accepting the truth. "He will try to stop you." Theodore closed the folder, his expression hard as stone. Let him try. Later that evening, back at their apartment, Theodore spread the documents across the table. Emily sat beside him, her expression tight as she scanned the pages. "This is it," she murmured. "This is the proof." Theodore nodded. "Now we just have to figure out what to do with it." Emily looked up at him, something sharp in her gaze. "We go public." Theodore hesitated. "You really think that's the best way?" She leaned forward. "Josh, your father has spent his entire life covering up the truth. If we try to fight him in private, he'll bury this before anyone even knows it exists." She pointed at the papers. "But if we bring this to a journalist, someone who can expose everything, he won't be able to hide anymore." Theodore exhaled slowly. She was right. Julian's power came from controlling the narrative. The only way to stop him was to take that control away. "I know someone," Amelie added after a moment. "A journalist. I met him a few years ago when he did a piece on small businesses. He's legit, and he's not afraid to take on powerful people." Theodore studied her. "You trust him?" Amelie nodded. "I do." Theodore ran a hand over his face, thinking fast. His father would come after them? He had no doubt about that, but for once he wasn't going to let fear decide for him. He reached for his phone. "Call him." Amelie didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone and dialed. Theodore listened as she spoke to the journalist, giving him a brief but clear explanation of what they had. He could hear the intrigue in the man's voice, the immediate hunger for the truth. A meeting was set. Tomorrow. Theodore hung up and turned to Amelie. "This is it." She met his gaze. "Are you ready for this?" Theodore let out a slow breath. No, but he was doing it anyway. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't running from his father. He was running toward the truth. And he was ready to burn Julian Morgan's empire to the ground. The next morning, Theodore sat in a small cafe across from Ethan Hayes, the journalist Amelia had reached out to. Ethan was younger than Theodore had expected. Mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with a calm confidence that suggested he'd seen his fair share of battles against powerful men. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So, you're telling me you have evidence that Julian Morgan, the Julian Morgan, has been blackmailing employees, fabricating charges, and ruining lives to protect his empire?" Theodore placed the black folder on the table between them. "I'm not telling you, I'm showing you." Ethan reached for the folder, flipping through the pages. His eyes moved quickly, scanning document after document. As he read, his expression shifted. First curiosity, then disbelief, and finally, something darker. He let out a low whistle. "Jesus, this is substantial." Looking up, he asked, "Where did you get this?" Theodore hesitated for half a second before answering. "My mother," Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Clara Morgan?" Theodore nodded. Ethan exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "That's unexpected. Tell me about it." Theodore muttered. Amelie, sitting beside him, cleared her throat. "Ethan, if you publish this story, Julian will come after you. Hard." Ethan smirked, tapping the folder. "If I was afraid of powerful men, I'd be writing about celebrity diets and real estate trends." He closed the folder. "This is real, and if it all checks out, I want to be the one to take it public." Theodore studied him. "How do we make sure this doesn't get buried?" Ethan's smirk widened. "We make it loud. This isn't just an article. It's a full-scale exposé. Interviews, leaked documents, financial records. We hit him from every angle." He tapped the folder again. "You said your mother was willing to talk?" Theodore nodded. "She knows more than what's in there, and if she's finally ready to go against him, she'll back it up." Ethan's eyes lit up. A whistleblower from inside the Morgan family? That's gold. Theodore's stomach twisted. He knew what this meant for his mother. She wasn't just stepping out of Julian's shadow, she was stepping into a war. And so was he. Ethan checked his watch. "I'll need to verify these documents, cross-check sources, but if everything holds up, I'll have a first draft ready within a week." Theodore clenched his jaw. "That fast?" Ethan smiled. "You want to take down your father, Morgan? You do it before he sees you coming." That evening, back at their apartment, Theodore sat with Amélie, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Amélie reached for his hand. "How are you feeling?" Theodore let out a dry laugh. "Like I just declared war on a man who doesn't lose." Amélie squeezed his hand. "Then we'll make sure he loses." He looked at her, his chest tightening. She believed in him, in this fight, in what they were doing, and for the first time, he truly believed it too. A sudden knock at the door shattered the moment. Theodore tensed instantly. Amélie glanced at him. "Are you expecting someone?" He shook his head slowly. Rising to his feet, he approached the door, his heartbeat pounding. He checked the peephole and froze. A sharp surge of anger shot through him. "Harris Denton!" Theodore yanked the door open. "What the hell do you want?" Harris smirked. "Good to see you too, kid." He glanced past Theodore, spotting Amélie inside. "Hope I'm not interrupting." Theodore stepped out, shutting the door behind him. "You have 5 seconds before I slam this door in your face." Harris chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Relax, I'm just the messenger." Theodore folded his arms. "Then deliver the message and get lost." Harris's smirk faded. "Julian wants to meet." Theodore scoffed. "Not happening." Harris shrugged. "Suit yourself, but he's willing to negotiate." Theodore's eyes narrowed. Julian Morgan didn't negotiate. "He knows about the journalist," Harris continued. "He knows what you're planning." His gaze turned colder. "And he wants to make you an offer before you do something you'll regret." Theodore felt fury rise in his chest. "The only thing I regret is not exposing him sooner." Harris sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, Josh. I've worked for your father a long time. I know how this goes. If you push him, he'll push back harder. This isn't a fight you can win." Theodore stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. "Then, he's finally going to learn what it feels like to lose." Harris studied him for a long moment, then exhaled, shaking his head. "All right, have it your way." He turned to leave, but paused. "One last thing, if you go through with this, you better be ready, because once that story is out, there's no going back." Theodore didn't flinch. "Good." Harris nodded once, then disappeared into the night. Theodore stood there, his chest rising and falling with adrenaline. When he finally stepped back inside, Amelie was already waiting. "What was that about?" Theodore took a deep breath. "Julian knows." Amelie's face darkened. "So what do we do?" Theodore clenched his fists. "We finish this." He picked up his phone and dialed Ethan. The journalist answered on the first ring. "Morgan, run the story," Theodore said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Expose him." Ethan paused, then let out a slow breath. "You sure?" Theodore's grip tightened on the phone. Julian had controlled him his entire life, but not anymore. "I'm sure," he said, and with that, the battle truly began. The morning after Theodore made the call, the world exploded. It started with a headline exclusive: "The Dark Empire of Julian Morgan. Corruption, sabotage, and the lives destroyed in the name of power." The article dropped at exactly 6 a.m. By 7:30 it was everywhere. News outlets picked it up, social media caught fire, the name Julian Morgan trended worldwide, but not for the reasons he would have wanted. Theodore sat in the apartment staring at his phone as notification after notification poured in. His heart pounded as he skimmed the article, even though he already knew every word. Ethan had held nothing back. It was all there. The payoffs, the fabricated accusations, the employees Julian had silenced over the years, including Linda Foster. Mellie's mother's story was woven into the larger narrative of Morgan Industries' ruthless history, painting a picture of a man who built an empire on the destruction of others. Then came the final blow: Clara Morgan's statement. She had spoken to Ethan on record, confirming that Julian had manipulated, intimidated, and orchestrated firings to maintain control. For the first time, someone from inside his own family had turned against him. Theodore had exhaled, grip tightening on his phone. This was it, the point of no return. Amelie sat beside him, scrolling through her own phone. "People are furious, Josh. He can't cover this up." Theodore looked at her, his chest tightening. "I know." And yet, deep down, a part of him was still waiting for the moment Julian would strike back. Because Julian Morgan never went down without a fight. By noon, the first official statement from Morgan Industries was released. Theodore had expected damage control, empty words about integrity, denials, maybe even an attempt to paint himself as the victim, but he hadn't expected silence. No press conference, no rebuttal, no legal threats, nothing. That was more terrifying than any public statement, because that meant Julian was planning something. Theodore paced the apartment, restless, uneasy. "He's not going to let this go," he muttered. Amelie looked up from her laptop. "He might not have a choice." She gestured to the screen. "Companies are already distancing themselves. His business partners, his investors, they're pulling out." Theodore crossed his arms. "So that's it? It's just happening?" Amelie met his gaze, her voice steady. "Josh, this isn't just some scandal. This is exposure on a national level. Your father isn't invincible anymore." Theodore wanted to believe that. He really did. But he knew Julian Morgan too well. It wasn't until late that night that the first crack appeared. Theodore's phone buzzed. Blocked number. His stomach twisted. He already knew who it was. Without a word, he answered. A beat of silence. Then a voice, calm, composed, but laced with something darker. "You have no idea what you've done." Theodore's fingers curled into fists. "Oh, I think I do." Julian exhaled sharply. "You think this is a victory, that you've won?" A dry, humorless chuckle. "You don't win against me, Theodore. You just delay the inevitable." Theodore clenched his jaw. "You're done, Dad. The world knows who you are. It's over." Another silence, then Julian's voice dropped. "You are no longer my son." Theodore's breath caught in his throat. Not because it hurt, not anymore, but because there was no anger in Julian's voice. Only cold finality. For a second, Theodore felt the ghost of the boy he used to be, the one who had spent his whole life chasing this man's approval. But then he let that boy go. He exhaled slowly. "I stopped being your son the day you tried to control my life." A beat of silence. Then the call ended. Theodore lowered the phone, his heart pounding. Millie touched his arm. "Josh?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's done," he said. Emily frowned. "That's not like him." Theodore nodded. "I know." And that was what scared him the most. The next morning, the world shifted again. Julian Morgan resigned. Theodore nearly dropped his phone when he saw the headline. Morgan Industries CEO steps down amid corruption allegations, company in freefall. The article was brief. Direct Julian had released one final statement, citing a need to step away and allow the company to move forward without distraction. A lie, of course. He wasn't stepping away. He was being forced out. Theodore exhaled, rubbing his face. It was really happening. His father's empire was crumbling, and for the first time, Theodore was free. Emily walked up behind him, glancing at his phone. "He's really gone," Theodore nodded slowly. "Yeah." Emily let out a soft breath. "How do you feel?" Theodore thought about it. For years, he had imagined this moment, breaking free from his father, proving he could survive on his own. And yet, now that it was here, he didn't feel triumphant. He just felt lighter. He looked at Emily, at the life they had built in Austin, at what mattered. "I feel..." He searched for the right word. Then, finally, he found it. "Ready." Emily smiled, slipping her arms around him. "Good. Because for the first time, the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. And Theodore Morgan was finally free to live it." The morning after Julian Morgan's resignation, the world felt different. For the first time in his life, Theodore wasn't looking over his shoulder. No more battles to fight, no more schemes to uncover, no more waiting for his father to make the next move. It was over. He sat at the small kitchen table in their apartment, a cup of coffee in front of him, staring at the newspaper spread across the surface. The headline read, "The Fall of a Titan. Julian Morgan's resignation marks the end of an era." Theodore ran his fingers over the bold letters, letting the reality sink in. His father was gone, not in the physical sense. Julian was still out there somewhere, licking his wounds, nursing his pride. But the power, the control, the influence that had shaped his entire life? That was gone. He had spent so long fighting to prove himself, to escape the weight of his last name. Now that he expected to feel more, but instead he just felt free. Amelie walked into the kitchen, her hair still damp from the shower, her growing belly just barely visible under the oversized sweater she wore. She stopped when she saw him staring at the paper. "Still trying to believe it?" she asked softly. Theodore smirked. "Something like that." Amelie stepped closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, Josh," he exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, I did." She sat across from him, watching him carefully. "So? What now?" That was the question, wasn't it? For so long, his future had been tied to his father's expectations. Even after he walked away, he had still been running, proving to himself, to the world, that he could survive without Julian Morgan's money, his influence, his name. But now, there was nothing left to run from, and that meant, for the first time, he had to figure out what he actually wanted. Theodore looked at Amelie, at the woman who had stood beside him through everything, at the life they had built together. Simple, but real. "I think..." He paused, considering his words. "I think I just want to live." Amelie smiled. "That's a good start." Later that day, Theodore walked through the doors of Savannah's bakery like he did every morning. But today felt different. Mrs. Savannah looked up from the register, eyeing him over the rim of her glasses. "You gonna stand there looking dramatic, or are you actually gonna do some work?" Theodore chuckled. "Morning to you too, Mrs. Savannah." She smirked. "You see the news?" He leaned against the counter. "Yeah, it's everywhere." Mrs. Savannah nodded, wiping her hands on a towel. "So, what does that mean for you?" Theodore hesitated. "I don't know yet." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the back. "Well, until you figure it out, there's dough that needs kneading." Theodore grinned. On it. That afternoon, just as he was finishing up, the bell above the bakery door chimed. He glanced up and froze. Clara Morgan stood in the doorway. She looked out of place in an elegant designer coat, surrounded by the warm, bustling bakery, but there was something different about her. Something softer. Theodore wiped his hands on his apron and stepped forward. Mom. She smiled, a little hesitant. Theodore. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Clara exhaled. I wanted to see you. Theodore folded his arms. Why now? Her gaze flickered around the bakery, taking in the scent of fresh bread, the quiet murmur of customers chatting over pastries. I guess I just wanted to see the life you chose. Theodore held her gaze, searching for the meaning behind her words. Clara's lips curved into a small smile. I think you chose well. Something tightened in his chest. His mother had never said that before, never told him she was proud, never acknowledged that he had made the right decision. He swallowed. You really mean that? She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. I do, and for the first time in years, Theodore felt like her son again. That evening, Theodore and Amélie sat together on their tiny balcony, watching as the sun dipped below the Austin skyline, casting the city in shades of gold and crimson. The bakery had long since closed for the night. The streets below were quiet, a rare hush settling over the normally bustling city, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Theodore's mind was just as still. Amélie nestled against his shoulder, her warmth familiar, comforting. So, I have a crazy idea, she murmured. Theodore chuckled, the sound low and amused. That's never a reassuring way to start a conversation. She grinned, mischief dancing in her eyes. What if we open our own bakery? Theodore blinked, caught off guard. Wait, what? Amélie sat up, her excitement palpable. Think about it, she said, her hands gesturing as if she could mold the idea right in front of them. You love baking. You love working with your hands, creating something real. And now, her voice softened, now that you're free, you can do anything. Why not do something that actually makes you happy? The words settled deep in Theodore's chest. His own bakery, his own business. Not something dictated by his father's influence or anyone else's expectations, just something that was his, that was theirs. Slowly a smile tugged at his lips. You know, that's not a bad idea. Amélie's grin widened. I know. Theodore turned to her, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Then let's do it. Her eyes lit up. Really? He glanced out at the city, at the life they had built together from nothing but determination and love. For the first time, the future wasn't something he had to fight for. It was something he could shape with his own hands. Yeah, he said, his voice steady. Let's build something great. And this time, it would be theirs. 1 year later, the rich scent of fresh bread and warm vanilla curled through the air as Theodore rolled up the sleeves of his crisp chef's coat, dusting his hands with flour. The morning rush had just ended, leaving the bakery in a peaceful lull, quiet enough to breathe, yet still alive with the murmur of conversation and the soft clinking of coffee cups against saucers. Above the door, in elegant hand-painted letters, hung the sign. Foster and Morgan Bakery. Their bakery, their legacy. Theodore took a slow look around, letting the moment sink in. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows, casting golden patches across the rustic wooden tables. The glass display case gleamed, filled with golden croissants, delicate pastries, and loaves of sourdough lined up like proud soldiers. Near the register, a small chalkboard sign in Amélie's neat handwriting read, "Welcome home." And that's exactly what it felt like. Home emerged from the kitchen. Amélie emerged, her apron tied snugly around her waist, her hair swept into a messy bun that somehow made her look even more beautiful. She wiped her hands on a towel before flashing him a smile. We survived the morning rush, she teased. Theodore smirked, shaking his head. Barely. Amélie set a tray of warm cinnamon rolls onto the counter, the scent of sugar and spice filling the air. I told you we'd need to bake extra today. Theodore raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. I refuse to believe people consume this many pastries. Molly laughed, a knowing glint in her eyes. Josh, we literally own a bakery. He smirked, reaching for one of the cinnamon rolls and taking a bite. The soft dough melted on his tongue, the icing just the right balance of sweet. He sighed in reluctant defeat. Okay, fine, maybe you have a point. She nudged his shoulder playfully before glancing toward the back of the shop. Her voice softened. How's he doing? Theodore followed her gaze to the small playpen tucked into the cozy corner of the bakery, where a tiny one-year-old boy was happily babbling to himself, surrounded by stuffed animals and miniature toy baking utensils. "Ihr son Matteo." Theodore felt a familiar warmth bloom in his chest as he watched the little boy clutch a toy rolling pin in his chubby fingers, gleefully banging it against the playpen's side. "He's going to take over the business by the time he's 3, Theodore mused, his voice laced with fond amusement. Amélie grinned. "Well, he does have a strong will." Theodore turned to her, his expression tender. "And a mother who never stops believing in us." Amélie's eyes softened and she stepped closer, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips. "We built this, Josh. We made this life together." He exhaled, letting the weight of her words settle inside him. For so long he had feared he would never be enough. That without his father's name, without his wealth, without the carefully carved-out path that had been forced upon him, he would fail. But here he was, successful, fulfilled, happy, and he had done it without Julian Morgan's power, without his control. He had done it on his own terms. The soft chime of the bakery door opening pulled Theodore from his thoughts. He turned, expecting a customer, but the moment he saw who it was, his entire body went still. Standing in the doorway was Clara Morgan. She looked different from the last time he had seen her. Light. She no longer carried the heavy weight of being Julian Morgan's wife, no longer wore the carefully composed mask she had maintained for so many years. She was free. Clara stepped forward hesitantly, her eyes sweeping over the bakery, drinking it in. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Theodore swallowed, his voice even when he finally spoke. "Thanks." Her gaze drifted toward Matteo, and for a fleeting second something flickered across her face. Something raw, something fragile. Longing. "He's grown so much," she whispered. The Theodore nodded. "Yeah, he has." A pause. Then, tentatively, she asked, "May I?" Theodore glanced at Amélie, who met his gaze with an encouraging nod. He exhaled before stepping aside, allowing his mother to approach the playpen. Matteo looked up, his wide, curious eyes locking onto hers. Clara knelt, reaching out cautiously, as if afraid to break whatever delicate moment was forming between them. Matteo studied her for a moment, then, without hesitation, grabbed her fingers, giggling. Clara let out a small, choked laugh, her shoulders trembling slightly. "He's perfect," she whispered. Theodore felt something tighten in his chest. For years he had resented her, for staying with Julian, for letting him dictate their lives, for being complicit in the control that had suffocated him. But now, as he watched her with Matteo, something shifted. She had escaped too. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to rebuild something. Clara looked up at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I know I wasn't the mother you needed me to be back then, Theodore. But I'd like to try now, if you'll let me." Theodore exhaled slowly. The wounds between them wouldn't heal overnight. There were years of silence, of lost moments, of choices that couldn't be undone. But he wasn't the same man he had once been. And maybe, for the first time in his life, neither was she. He had learned that family wasn't defined by blood, legacy, or the weight of expectation. It was about choice. The quiet, unwavering decision to stand by one another, time and time again. And right now, watching his mother with his son, he was willing to choose. He nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah, we can try." Clara let out a soft breath, the tension in her shoulders easing as she blinked away the tears threatening to spill. Amélie stepped closer, lacing her fingers through Theodore's, grounding him in the warmth of her touch. He looked at her, at Matteo, at the bakery, at the life they had built with their own hands. A life untouched by the past. A life they had chosen. And as the scent of warm bread and cinnamon wrapped around them, as Matteo giggled in his grandmother's arms, as Amélie gave his hand a gentle squeeze, Theodore Morgan knew, with absolute certainty, he had won. Did you enjoy this story? If so, drop a like and leave a kind comment to encourage us. Your support means the world. And don't forget, we love you.